The only thing better than a superhero movie is a superhero team-up, and there are some team-ups we'd love to see. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they fall in love, sometimes they become the odd couple we've always wanted to see. But when heroes team up, the results are two great tastes that taste great together. The Marvel Universe is full of characters whose chocolate we'd love to see in another's peanut butter. Here are some we're hoping to see, and some we wish we could have. When you're the Hulk, sometimes you want to just get away. You'd think being an unstoppable smashing machine would mean that people would be more than willing to give you some space, but alas, that's not the case for the mean green wrecking machine. When you're a rogue super soldier experiment and mutant, sometimes you just want to get away, you know? You'd think that being an unstoppable berserker with unbreakable claws would mean that people would be more than willing to give you some space, but alas, that's not the case for Logan, the man they call Wolverine. Where can two nearly indestructible forces of nature go to get a little me time? Why, the frozen north of Canada, eh? When these two kindred spirits met in that gorgeous but unforgiving winter wonderland, it was… they fought. Oh, and the Wendigo was there. No one likes a fifth wheel. Incredible Hulk 181 introduced the world to Wolverine. And while the two never became fast friends, the Hulk and Wolverine are forever tied. Thanks to the complicated nature of film rights, the Hulk hasn't gotten a solo movie since he wore a different face in The Incredible Hulk. But with the complicated world of film rights getting slightly less complicated, with Disney absorbing Fox, what better way to introduce the Wolverine to the MCU than have him meet the ever-loving Hulk? Deadpool has become one of the most popular characters in Marvel Comics, made even more so by Ryan Reynolds' pitch-perfect performance in 2 Deadpool movies. 2 Canada references in 2 entries, wow! The Merc with a Mouth is known for his unshakable irreverence and fourth wall breaks. But he isn't the first character in Marvel Pantheon known to crack wise under pressure. Peter Parker, the spectacular Spider-Man, has turned nervous chatter into an art form. Clever banter is not why these two should get together, though. In the comics, Deadpool has had a lot of team-ups and partners, but only one of those partners actually made Deadpool want to be a better person. The comic run of Spider-Man and Deadpool provided great laughs, as well as the usual dose of excitement, but it also did something Colossus couldn't manage in the movies, instilling Uncle Ben's advice about power and responsibility to Wade Wilson. They even managed to get some use out of Spider-Man's spider buggy on a road trip where Deadpool introduced Spider-Man to the concept of breaking the fourth wall. What could be better than an MCU road trip with the 2 fastest mouths in the MCU? Oh, and a dune buggy. Dune buggies are super cool. Nothing good ever comes from Galactus coming to town. Generally speaking, it means that he wants to make a meal out of said town and every other town on the planet. Galactus is the hungriest hippo in the multiverse, and that hunger can never be sated, just temporarily fed. Finding edible planets is a labor-intensive task. So the big purple planet eater dolls out the power cosmic to select beings to be his herald. The best known of these is a man called Norrin Radd, who agreed to be a herald of Galactus in order to save his own planet, only to be never allowed to return. When it came time to serve Earth up on a platter, however, the noble Silver Surfer turned on his master, who left the Earth alone temporarily and the Surfer bound to it. In order to defeat an encroaching darkness threatening to consume the universe, Galactus has enlisted the already powerful Thor with the power cosmic as the Herald of Thunder. Who better to show the Thunderer the ropes of being Galactus' Yelp reviewer of tasty planets than the Surfer, one of the first heralds to tell the big guy, no. Even when the rights to characters are under the same umbrella, there can be bureaucratic barriers to get the team-ups we all want to see. Daredevil's rights reverted back to Marvel not long after the MCU got rolling, but the Man Without Fear didn't make another appearance on the big screen. Instead, Daredevil led off a series of shows featuring heroes whose activities were more restricted to the streets of New York on Netflix. That's when fans learned the difference between Marvel Studios and Marvel Entertainment. While complicated, the difference meant that Daredevil and Captain America were in the same universe but would never really interact. The Man Out of Time and the Man Without Fear have had some important team-ups, including a rough partnership in the comic book version of Civil War. One of the driving elements of modern Captain America stories is Rogers trying to reconcile World War II-era idealism with the complex realities of the modern world, including the fact that his time wasn't as ideal as he thought. Most of the people who guided Cap through more complex understanding of the modern world is Matt Murdock, the Daredevil. While some heroes' day job is being rich, Daredevil operates a law clinic where sometimes he even represents the people he helped catch. In stories like Civil War and Daredevil Born Again, the two have learned from each other. Charlie Cox and Chris Evans have both turned in amazing performances as the heroes, Maybe the multiverse can give us what we missed out on, huh? For comic book fans, the announcement that the mutants were coming to the MCU right about the time that Captain Marvel got a solo movie meant one thing: Carol Danvers and Rogue are going to have to meet. A big part of the MCU's Captain Marvel story was Carol Danvers' missing memories. That was thanks to Yon-Rogg and the Supreme Intelligence, but in the comics, it's a little more complicated. You know the story: an adopted mother, Mystique, gets in her head that Carol Danvers will do her in. Her young charge takes it upon herself to stop her, accidentally absorbs Danvers' powers and all her memories, and starts a long rivalry between the Avenger and the member of the X-Men. Through the efforts of Professor X, Danvers has regained her memories, but no attachment to them, and Rogue has managed to make better friends than Mystique. But when you steal someone's memories, that's not really something you can just get over. We did get a version of Rogue in the Fox X-Men franchise, but without a Captain Marvel, we never really got the Rogue most people know from the comics. Now that both characters are under the same umbrella, we could get frenemies to rival Captain America and Iron Man most friendly disagreements. Mostly. One of the connecting themes in the Marvel Universe, of course, is the importance of responsibility when it comes to power. The other is better living through science. Being a child of the Silver Age of comics, a lot of Marvel superheroes are either accidents of science, products of science, or science experiments gone wrong. With all that science, you need a lot of big science brains. Well, Marvel has plenty of those. There's tech billionaire Tony Stark and his ever-evolving suit of armor. The foremost expert on gamma radiation, chiefly by having an extra heavy dose unleash an unstoppable rage monster inside Bruce Banner. A flexible genius exposed to cosmic rays. A teenage genius bitten by a radioactive spider. And a woman who grew up in the labs of the most technologically advanced nation on the MCU's Earth. Between them, their advances have been both the cure and cause of some of Marvel Universe's biggest problems. Anytime two of these big minds have gotten together, whether it's to build a time machine or fix a super android, the results have been entertaining. What better way to celebrate the super science of science fiction than having the geniuses of the MCU team up? What could go wrong? I mean, lots of things. Lots of things. But that's all part of the fun. Some heroes with similar powers are directly related, like Jennifer Walters and her cousin Bruce Banner, who now share a set of powers thanks to an emergency blood transfusion. Then there are those who get similar set of powers without any relation at all. Jessica Drew gained the ability to do whatever a spider can through her parents' direct experimentation. Walters doesn't share her cousin's head for science, but that doesn't mean she's not without options. Instead, like Matt Murdock, she takes up law. Drew, on the other hand, follows in another famous Jessica Drew's footsteps and becomes a private investigator. What better legal team can you imagine than a lawyer with Hulk powers and her private investigator with spider powers? Even better, while Walters has taken her superpowered life in stride and become the personable type, Drew has a tendency to rub people the wrong way. We know that the She-Hulk is coming to the MCU. Having fellow Lady Liberators member Jessica Drew doing her investigative work would be all that much more fun. Some people are born for greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Some have to be born into greatness and have it thrust upon them, like the half-celestial, half-human Peter Quill. Or as he manages to get almost no one to call him, Star-Lord. Scott Lang just wanted to be able to spend time with his daughter and watch her grow up. Between an unfortunate stretch in jail and then Thanos, he missed most of that. Regardless, both heroes have managed to make the most of things. They also both have a tendency to let their mouth run them into extra bits of trouble, and sometimes even out of it. Okay, so really when it comes down to it, this team-up is almost entirely based on how enjoyable it would be to see Chris Pratt and Paul Rudd share scenes as fast-talking superheroes. But the combination of Galactic Thief and Terrestrial Thief with a shrinky suit promises to result in some great adventures as well. The Master of the Mystical Arts and the God of Mischief have actually already met, and it was the highlight of a movie that was riddled with highlights. Doctor Strange has been tasked with protecting the Earth from mystic threats, and after the Battle of New York, there was perhaps no greater threat than Loki. That came about from Loki's sibling rivalry with his adopted brother Thor, and a troubled bid for a fickle dad's love. So things are complicated. By the time Ragnarok came around, Loki had moved closer to the ally column than adversary. But with Loki, that line is always a little fuzzy. Of course, Loki had that unfortunate run-in with Thanos, but a Loki from a different time have skipped out of the timeline to set off on a new set of adventures. Who better to guide that Loki towards the more friend than enemy path than the only person who has been a match for Loki's magical manipulations than Doctor Strange himself? It might even be Doctor Strange could help the alternate timeline Loki find his way to our timeline, joining other timeline replacements like Gamora. More than a few of these team-ups are between some noted frenemies, but none of them are perhaps more noted than Venom and Spider-Man. The rogue Clintarian Symbiote and the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man have had their destinies tied together ever since Parker mistook Venom for a wardrobe change on the Beyonders' battle world in Secret Wars. While the symbiote suit came with upgrades, it also came with the Clintarians' tendency to bring out adrenaline and anger in their host, causing Parker to do a hard breakup in a bell tower. Obviously, the symbiote didn't take the breakup well, and Eddie Brock has been haunting Peter Parker ever since. Venom's combination of love and hate for Spider-Man has made Venom a premier member of Spider-Man's already spectacular rogues gallery. That also resulted in team-ups. Whether it's Venom giving an assist in taking down his more vicious offspring Carnage, or the ever-optimistic Peter trying to teach Venom what it means to be a good guy, the combination of Spider-Man and Venom has been one of the best in comics. We might actually be getting our wish with this one, though for the time being only in the form of a cameo, with rumors going around that when Venom 2 hits, whenever movies hit in the future, Tom Holland's Spider-Man might be making a cameo. Some team-ups have almost happened, but not quite the way we know them. Wolverine has always been terrible at being a loner. No matter how much he does his lone wolf routine, he keeps teaming up with people or joining other teams. One of the first and most iconic is when he took a young member of the X-Men under his wing, training her and acting like a mentor. No, not Rogue, Kitty Pryde. While every 80s comic book kid's secret crush did eventually make her way to Fox's X-Men franchise, she found her role as Wolverine's favorite replaced by the Southerner with the ability to absorb powers. Kitty Pryde's story took a lot of those hits. In the comic book story Days of Futures Past, it's Kitty Pryde who does the time skipping to convince her mentor to alter the course of future history. Kitty Pryde has also run in with Wolverine's former mentor after her dad got in a little trouble in Japan, resulting in Pryde being trained as a ninja, and Logan having to bring her back from the accompanying brainwashing. Parts of that story were used for the Wolverine, though again without Kitty Pryde. That was then though, and this is now, and with a fresh start, we have a fresh opportunity to have Wolverine's best mentor relationship brought to life. Spider-Man has some amazing friends. One of those amazing friendships has been with another young person who suddenly found himself possessing great power, Richard Rider. Instead of getting bitten by something radioactive, Rider was granted the gear of a fallen Nova Corps soldier, becoming Nova. As this list shows, Spider-Man has a lot of great team-ups, and we're not even done pairing him up yet. But a few of them have been with someone he can truly relate to in the way he does with Nova. They're both young and idealistic, and thrust into a world bigger than either of them could have imagined. They both have to navigate an adult world of superheroes, while also trying to be regular teenagers. This has made the team-up between Spider-Man and Nova that much more special. Generally speaking, it's still the more experienced Spider-Man showing his young friend the superhero ropes, and that all-important lesson from Uncle Ben, but this time to someone who can relate to Peter's unique struggle. We all know that the Nova Corps had an unfortunate run-in with Thanos, and the Nova Corps have been shattered. It might only be a matter of time before a young Richard Rider finds one of those helmets. Hopefully, Parker will be there to show him the way. The only other hero to compete with the number of team-up potentials as Spider-Man on this list is the bad boy of the X-Men, Wolverine. Like we said, he's bad at being a loner. Spider-Man and Wolverine have actually done quite a lot of teaming up. They fought side by side and against each other, or against a wide variety of enemies, and even spent time as fellow Avengers. While you might think that Peter's sunny disposition would make Logan's sour outlook on life make for a rough friendship, but it's another Parker Guardians lesson that made Parker and Logan good friends. While Uncle Ben grabs all the headlines, it's Aunt May's compassion and understanding of broken people that has helped guide Parker to find the good in people and relate to their struggles. That level of empathy has allowed Pete to become something rare for Logan, a friend. Who better to smooth things over between the Hulk and Wolverine than the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man? Speaking of besties, one of the best stories to come out of Marvel's animation studios is the story of a young Inhuman with stretchy and go big powers and her superhero pal who can talk to squirrels. Look, it's more useful than it sounds, okay? You ever been to a park? Imagine all those squirrels got organized. Just look at what Ant-Man can do with ants, right? Squirrel Girl may have started out as a comic relief character and member of the comic relief Great Lakes Avengers, but since then she started her own solo series in 2014, and she has become a fast fan favorite. For Secret Warriors, Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, teams up with her friend Squirrel Girl to become proper superheroes when they run into Ghost Spider, better known as the alternate reality Spider-Gwen, voiced by Milana Voitrub. We know that Miss Marvel is headed to Disney Plus with her own series, and it'd be great to see her eager friend join her on her superhero journey. Plus, it might be another chance for Milana Voitrub, Lily from the AT&T ads, to portray the character after the New Warriors series was cancelled. The 2018 Venom movie answered the question, can you make Venom a movie without Spider-Man? With the second movie coming out in 2021, the question is, can you make a Venom movie with Spider-Man? What if Spider-Man became Venom? One of the defining characteristics of Venom has always been his obsessive relationship with his first earthly host, Spider-Man. With Venom effectively restarting Sony's spider-related universe for the third time, they've created a Venom who's never heard of Peter Parker. As the shifting sands of the Marvel and Sony deal, shift, there's room for Spider-Man and Venom to bond and perhaps even become Venom. And it might happen in Venom, There Will Be Carnage. This will make for a different kind of symbiote-Parker relationship, but there's still clues from the canon and the various deals to have an idea of what it might look like. The story of Peter Parker and the symbiote that would become his most obsessive villain is pretty well known. During Secret Wars, when Peter didn't have the time or resources to darn his suit, he went into an alien lab that gave him a suit that seemed to respond to his every command. It was, because it was a symbiote Clintarian that had been experimented on by the Kree and abandoned by his own kind. Poor Venom. He just wants a friend, to kill people with and eat some brains. When Peter Parker didn't get on with Venom's baser impulses, he went on a bell tower and got rid of the symbiote, who didn't take the breakup very well. Bonding with Eddie Brock, who thought Peter had cost him his job, Venom as we know him in the comics was born. Since then, Venom has had several hosts and different jobs, both as a good guy and a bad guy, or a bad good guy or a good bad guy. But Peter Parker has always been his number one. How can that story inform Peter Parker coming in late to the game for the cinematic Venom and Eddie Brock? Well, I'm glad you asked. Venom There Will Be Carnage is set to feature yet another symbiote, this time Carnage. It might seem redundant since Venom faced off against Riot in the first film, but Carnage isn't just another symbiote. In the comics, Carnage comes about when Brock leaves a little symbiote self behind in a jail cell. It turns out that's how symbiotes reproduce. A part of them just sort of falls off. Ugh. Each new generation tends to be a little stronger and meaner, and Carnage was just more than a chip off the old block. He turns out to be so mean and vicious that even bad guy Venom doesn't like him. This brings us back to Peter Parker's role in the next Spider-Man movie. The symbiote brings out the abilities of the people that host them. It's part of the reason why the Venom symbiote loved taking a ride on Peter Parker. In the Venom movie, Venom tells Brock that they're bonding because they're both kinda losers, but he could want more. We know that Venom There Will Be Carnage points to Sony on that one, that's super fun to say. Venom There Will Be Carnage. Anyway, we know that the new Venom movie will follow Morbius. Morbius the Living Vampire is another character with a complex relationship with Peter Parker. But why that's important is more about two small things tucked away in the trailer. First up is a poster of Spider-Man with the word murderer spray painted on it. The last we left our wall-crawling friend, he was giving MJ a ride on the Web Swing Express when J. Jonah Jameson came on and blamed Spider-Man not only for the crimes of Mysterio, but also with Mysterio's death. Even worse, he outed Peter Parker as Spider-Man. After he spent all that time trying to avoid getting caught for the third time, Ned and MJ had already figured him out. Look, it's a hard secret to keep, alright? The other is appearance of Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, at the end of the trailer. All this points to one question we've had since Venom was announced. Is the Sony Spider-Verse part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? The answer, it seems, it's complicated. But what we do know is that Spider-Man in some sort is part of the Venom and Morbius world. And that world definitely has an opinion about Spider-Man that seems to be informed by his time in the MCU. There are two paths here that both end up with a symbiotic Spider-Man. The first is that a down-on-his-luck Peter Parker encounters Eddie Brock. This would be the first time that the symbiote has encountered an enhanced person, and Parker might just be down on his luck enough for that the Venom symbiote to feel like he might have found a new bestie with even more power. The Clintarians survive off the adrenaline of their hosts, becoming notorious for killing their hosts for the extra boost. Similarly, the movie symbiotes would likely prefer someone with more power. It's even possible that Peter Parker would welcome the symbiote. One of Parker's arcs in the MCU has been his feeling of inadequacy, that he's not good enough or doing enough to live up to his uncle's tacit legacy and the gifts he's been given. It leads him into getting in over his head with the Vulture and trusting Mysterio. When facing a foe as formidable as Carnage, Parker might think he needs all the help he can get, accepting the Venom symbiote only to reject it again because at his core, Peter is a good kid, and the symbiote is at best one friend who always goes way too far. This actually aligns with the origins of Carnage somewhat, in that Spider-Man had to team up with Venom to defeat Carnage. Now the Spider-Verse has a Venom in it that has been spurned by Peter Parker, maybe even getting his ever-present spider symbol on his chest. But there is another option. Movie Brock isn't in prison. He's free and working as an investigative reporter. According to the mid-credits scene in Venom, it's in that capacity that he meets Cletus Cassidy, who is destined to become Carnage. In this scenario, Cletus wouldn't be the first one to come in contact with Venom's little bundle of joy that becomes the Carnage symbiote. Instead, it would be Peter Parker who got a little venom in his peanut butter, separating from him in a similar manner as he did in the comics and causing the symbiote to go mad. Bonding with a human who is made out of the factory, he gives birth to Carnage, and now Venom has to step in and stop him. This solves what is ultimately a minor issue, but where did Carnage get the red and blue color scheme? Does it need that kind of explanation? No, not really. But the symbiotes kind of have a wait for it, symbiotic relationship with Peter Parker, and restoring that relationship will go a long way for the Sony Spider-Verse. We know that it's important because we also know that Sony's big plan for their corner of the Marvel Universe is the Sinister Six. The Sinister Six, of course, are the premier Spider-Man hating club, and almost certainly what Toomes is doing in that Morbius trailer. The Vulture is a founding member of the Sinister Six, as well as Scorpion, a fellow inmate with Toomes. Coming from the MCU, Toomes has the requisite special hate for Spider-Man to form a band determined to take down the Wallcrawler. By creating the special love-hate bond with Spider-Man and the symbiotes, it goes a long way in unifying these various Spider-Man-related properties. It also allows them to sit side by side with the MCU, and it's laid a lot of groundwork for the Clintarians. Remember Nowhere, the floating severed head of a Celestial? In the comics, the head was taken off its body by Null, the creator of the symbiotes. In fact, he used the head to create them. The cult members that attended Ronan the Accuser and Guardians of the Galaxy? They're Exelon monks, another creation of Null. That sweet sword that Hela had in Thor Ragnarok? It resembles All Black the Necro Sword, the first of the symbiotes. All of these elements have been supporting players in the MCU, but for Venom and the symbiotes, that's their history. It's a way to take part in the MCU story and run with it without having to be involved in the grand plans of Kevin Feige. It's that last part that's important, folks. Not so long ago, it seemed like the Sony and Marvel's sharing deal was a lot more temporary than we had hoped, with the two industry giants not being able to come to terms with the shared custody of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. It took Tom Holland and a few pints making a personal plea to the company to come together and make a deal. What we know about the deal is that the MCU gets to make a third Spider-Man movie and have Spider-Man guest star in another MCU movie. Since the trailer for the Morbius movie, it appears like that part of the deal is that Sony's spider properties get to acknowledge Spider-Man and his spider problems. Like that poster that says murderer, or his freshman foe Vulture giving Morbius a hard time. If the nature of the Sony and Marvel deal is limited to those specific appearances, then Sony would also be using that time to smoothly transition Spider-Man into their Spider-Verse, which could live parallel to the MCU one. This wouldn't be the first time that Marvel has had some tenuous continuity. Marvel itself once split between Marvel Studios and Marvel Entertainment, the latter of which produced the Marvel TV shows on ABC, Netflix, Freeform, and Hulu. While the shows would make slight nods to the cinematic world, to lesser and greater degrees, the amount they intercepted or even acknowledged the developments was at best convenient. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the show that most interacted with the movies, didn't appear to go through the blip. The Runaways even had their own set of time travel rules. It's possible that Sony could exist in this quasi-canonical way, with just enough relationship to the MCU to be a part of it, but with the freedom to be their own thing. I'm sure we'd all love to see Spider-Man interact with Spider-Man villains. There is a problem with all this, though. It's all a matter of timing and logistics. Venom There Will Be Carnage will be released after Morbius, but before the third Spider-Man movie. It was meant to come out much earlier, but we were all put in a timeout that has reshuffled movie releases. Either way, such a big development in Peter's life would have come after or in concert with whatever happens in the third Spider-Man movie, also set for a June 2021 release, though that might be pushed. The other problem is logistical. There are rumors that of course Tom Holland is in Venom, but with filming primarily done for the film, that still remains more or less a rumor without any indication of exactly how much of the movie Holland is in. A small part can be easy to hide, like the Ancient One having conversations with Bruce Banner, or J.K. Simmons appearing as J. Jonah Jameson at the end of Spider-Man Far From Home. But becoming a symbiote bonded with Spider-Man requires so much more. All this points to Peter Parker's role in Venom There Will Be Carnage being a small one, perhaps in the form of just a cameo or even an end credit scene. In that case, it could be that Spider-Man sits out Carnage showdown altogether, but instead finds himself bound with the symbiote at the end. This could go a long way towards setting up a larger story with the Clintarians as a part of either the MCU or the Sony Spider-Verse. We'll know one way or another when Venom There Will Be Carnage hits theaters June 25th, 2021. Here at CBR, there are a few things we love more than a good old character crossover. And since Sony and Disney are finally playing nice with their movie rights to Spider-Man, there's an increased chance we can see Tom Holland's Spider-Man interacting with the alien symbiote Venom. Comic book fans know Peter Parker is responsible for some of Venom's abilities, but which of them is actually stronger? If these two went head-to-head, who would come out on top? Well, obviously we would, since we get to watch it all play out from the comfort of our local movie theater. But could Spider-Man actually take down Venom on his own? Let's find out. Venom has a lot of incredible superpowers, but he's not exactly the master of subtlety. Hey, that's just part of his charm. While Spider-Man has his own set of impressive powers, let's not forget that his primary ability is also the most difficult to portray on the big screen. And it's a big reason why Spider-Man would be at a serious disadvantage in a one-on-one fight against Venom. Yes, we're talking about the infamous Spider Sense. It's not a flashy power, but it finds its way into pretty much every facet of Spider-Man's battle strategy. It's a precognitive sense that warns him of incoming threats, like during the Clash of the Avengers when Bucky Barnes hurled a bench at him. That could have done some serious damage if it connected with his head, but even though he was facing away from Bucky, he was still able to dodge because he could sense it coming. Or when he's just riding the school bus and he suddenly senses the Q-ship of Ebony Maw arriving in New York City in Infinity War. Even if you can't see his arm hair raise, you assume it's happening whenever danger is coming his way. Which is almost always, but just go ahead and guess which one of Spider-Man's abilities doesn't work on Venom. That's right. His spider sense might be the most important, albeit least flashy weapon in his arsenal, but it's also completely useless against Venom. You see, Venom and Peter Parker have a complicated history together. Before the alien symbiote bonded with Eddie Brock, it was pals with Peter Parker. Okay, maybe pals is a bit of a stretch, especially from Peter's perspective. Just look at what a nightmare their union was for Spider-Man and the despicable things he did under Venom's control. Terrible. Anyway, although Peter eventually broke free and broke Venom's heart, the two were bonded to one another. Venom was not only able to acquire some of Peter's abilities, but he also got an up-close and personal view of his spider sense in action. So much so that it's ineffective on him. Sneaking up on Spider-Man isn't easy, but it's something Venom is more than capable of. Sure, Peter Parker is pretty durable even on his own, and he has some help from his super suits, but his spider sense is his main form of defense, and he can't use it at all when he's up against Venom. It's a devastating blow, and it doesn't just affect his defensive capabilities. Spider-Man is strong, but he's also incredibly agile, and that's a huge part of his fighting abilities. We've seen him lose his spider sense before, like when Peter Parker makes an electronic device to disable the precognitive abilities of the Slayers, and it ends up affecting him too. He ended up having to relearn how to fight with the help of Shang-Chi, who helped him learn the way of the spider, or spider-fu as Peter likes to call it. And really, that's much more fun to say. Relying on spider-fu means no long-range attacks, zoning in on clusters of nerves, and taking advantage of pressure points. Or, things that really aren't that helpful when you're fighting an alien symbiote like Venom. The fact that the symbiote was once bonded to Peter means it has all the knowledge it needs to destroy him. Kinda reminds me of my relationship with my ex. Anyway, even we've seen Spider-Man at his best against Venom, and he's not really Spider-Man. Okay, that might not make sense, but it does in the comic books. Ben O'Reilly is a clone of Peter Parker who usually goes by Scarlet Spider and never bonded with Venom. The DNA used to create Ben predated Peter bonding with Venom, which meant Venom triggered Ben's spider sense, giving him a huge advantage in their confrontation. But for regular Earth 616 Peter Parker, his spider sense would be out of commission in this fight. Watch out, Pete. Of course, Peter has plenty of other powers, but let's not forget that so does Venom. Like the fact that Venom can just make more symbiotes if he wants to, and he has. And it seems like his immunity to the spider sense is hereditary, since it doesn't work on Carnage either. Fighting against a single alien symbiote is one thing, but how about a whole team of them? It might seem unfair for Venom to outnumber his opponent by making his own teammates, but since when does he worry about playing fair? And that's just another strike against Peter Parker in this fight. He's definitely not perfect, but it's safe to say Peter is a good guy. Well, usually. Peter's a hero, which means he has to think about the safety of others when he's in a fight. Just think about that scene in Age of Ultron when Tony Stark takes on the Hulk. Even though Tony's wearing armor designed for just this purpose, he's still at a disadvantage because he has to worry about all the innocent bystanders who could get easily crushed. Meanwhile, the Hulk, well, that's not really on his radar. Tony still manages to triumph because of the aforementioned special Hulkbuster armor, but he's definitely slowed down because of his dedication to others, while the Hulk can just go all out. If Venom and Peter were having their fight anywhere near other people, that would be a huge distraction for Peter. It sounds weird to say, but the fact that he values human life would be a liability in this fight. Venom, well, he doesn't have that problem. And neither do any of his other symbiotes that he could bring to the battle. Oh, and did we mention these other symbiotes like Agony, Phage, and Riot all have their own special abilities? And if the fight takes place somewhere with no innocent bystanders, Venom would likely still have a sizable advantage. Spider-Man has been to space before, but he needs to have the proper equipment, and if there's a malfunction, he could be in serious danger. Meanwhile, outer space is Venom's home turf. Not only can he breathe in space, but he can also breathe underwater, which Peter obviously can't. In Carnage Unleashed, Venom even travels through the internet. Can Peter Parker email himself? We didn't think so. Advantage, Venom. Venom can also camouflage himself to better sneak up on Spider-Man since he can't be detected via spider sense. And while the MCU version of Spider-Man relies on web shooters, Venom makes his own webbing, which means there's less potential for something to go wrong. Of course, if it loses too much, it weakens itself, but it can't afford to be a little more careless than Peter Parker. Not only can Venom toss webbing around, but it can also use its entire body as a weapon. It can even control the bits of itself it shoots off, while Spider-Man's webbing just sticks to things. Venom's whole being is pretty much an arsenal, while Spider-Man is limited to the devices he can carry on his person and his own talents. Oh, and all Venom's weapons are also sentient. Now, we're not saying Venom could absolutely annihilate Spider-Man, and there's no way he could even begin to fight back. Venom has weaknesses that can be easily exploited, like fire and sound. Peter Parker is an expert at putting together handy gadgets, so with some prep and time and knowledge of the symbiote, he can do some damage for sure. But he's also very clever and resourceful, and that counts for a lot in this fight. For example, if he could trick Venom into expending most of his material, he could weaken it enough to defeat it. Then there's the fact that we've been assuming this is the symbiote attached to Eddie Brock, since he's the one who bonded with it in the Venom movie. But Venom's strength relates to how strongly his host hates Peter Parker, which is what makes him and Eddie Brock such a powerful pair. If Venom is bound to a less intense host, then it would be much easier for Spider-Man to stand against him. It's not impossible for him to beat Venom alone, but by comic book and comic book movie standards, nothing is really impossible. As much as we don't like to say our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man may be outmatched here, well, he may be outmatched here. Being part of a superhero team is more than just having moral support, especially since emotional intelligence and open communication are things even the best heroes struggle with sometimes. Being on a team means everyone brings their own strengths and weaknesses to the fight. Black Widow might not be able to do much if you're trying to bring down a building, but if you're sending someone on a spy mission, it probably shouldn't be the Incredible Hulk. With Venom's adaptability, having allies to call on in a fight is pretty much a requirement. But what are the odds that Venom and Spider-Man will be coming to face on the big screen anytime soon? Actually, considering recent events, the odds seem pretty darn good. We all know about the Sony-Disney struggle over the movie rights to Spider-Man. After much negotiating and a ton of tears from us, and just not from the movie studio execs, they managed to work it out so Spider-Man gets at least one more standalone movie in the MCU, and he will appear in one additional MCU film. Ever since Peter Parker first swung into the MCU, there's been talking about bridging the gap between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Sony's universe of Marvel characters. And some comments made by Marvel studio head Kevin Feige only make that crossover seem even more imminent. He said, "Spider-Man also happens to be the only hero with the superpower to cross cinematic universes. So as Sony continues to develop their own Spidey-verse, you never know what surprises the future might hold. We don't need superpowers to leap to conclusions, and that's just what we're gonna do here." It certainly sounds like Marvel and Sony are planning some kind of crossover event. Sony's Venom and Into the Spider-Verse both did well, and are getting sequels, so we wouldn't be too surprised to see Spider-Man and Venom sharing the screen time at some point. The only question is, will Spider-Man be by himself or will he have a team with him? Following Endgame, the Avengers roster is kinda empty, and Far From Home definitely put the pressure on Peter to replenish the ranks. And although Sony has the rights to Spider-Man and associated characters, they don't have nearly the same character library to pull from compared to Disney. If Sony wants to pit Spidey against Venom, it makes sense that Spider-Man would need some backup, especially in light of Carnage being teased at the end of the first Venom movie. If Tom Holland's Spider-Man ends up back with Sony, it's possible he won't be alone, at least not if he wants to survive. This could also be a way to touch on one of those Marvel comic book storylines fans have been clamoring for. When the Skrulls showed up in Captain Marvel, fans were sure a secret invasion storyline was imminent. This was a comic book crossover event which featured an invasion by the wicked shape-shifting Skrulls, and left our heroes wondering who they could trust. But as we now know, the Skrulls in Captain Marvel were directly not wicked, and in fact they had a pretty sympathetic backstory. So it seems like the secret invasion storyline wasn't going to be a thing. But let's not forget that one of Venom's abilities is shape-shifting. It can allow its host to blend in by mimicking any kind of clothing or the appearance of other people. Sure, it's not Skrull-level steel, but it definitely has some potential to build some serious mistrust among our heroes. We're not saying it would be an exact retelling of Secret Invasion, but it could capture enough of the storyline spirit to be entertaining. Spider-Man and Venom are a great combination, and they can only get more interesting when there are more characters involved.
Breaking up is hard to do. You have to separate your comic book collection and decide who gets the X-Men comics and who gets the Spider-Man comics and what to do with all those crossovers. It can be really emotional, I assume. Anyway, after 5 MCU appearances, including 2 solo movies, it seems like Sony and Disney have gone their separate ways again, with Sony taking their Spider-Man and going home. While Spider-Man no longer gets to be with the Avengers he loved so much, he does rejoin the rest of the Spider-Man universe that he left in Sony's hands, including one traditionally Spider-Man-obsessed symbiote. Does this mean we'll see Spidey in Venom 2? Let's look at why that might be. It's been an emotional roller coaster of announcements and counter-announcements as studio heads and stars have all publicly and privately come to terms with the fate of their wall crawler and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's familiar territory for Spider-Man. In the 1990s, when Marvel was struggling financially, they had a garage sale of sorts with the film rights to their characters. Stan Lee notably wanted to sell the entire lot as one unit, but couldn't get any takers, so, desperate for cash, they sold off their 3 biggest titles. Fox bought Fantastic Four, and Sony bought Spider-Man. But the path to the big screen for Spider-Man wasn't that smooth. Whatever you think of the 3 franchises we got, it could have gotten far worse. Which is all to say, Spider-Man is no stranger to issues of film rights. The latest spat comes after Sony, the final winner of the Who Gets the Rights to Spider-Man saga that had lasted over 25 years, forged a deal with Marvel when their attempt to reboot their franchise didn't work out as planned. Meanwhile, Marvel's shared cinematic universe was going gangbusters, checking off the #1 thing on most Marvel fans' wish list, including Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige. Sony and Marvel had come to an agreement to share the character, and Spider-Man swung his way into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, played by the affable Tom Holland. But the love affair had a time limit on it, and that was 2 movies. 2 movies later, and Spider-Man is in the superhero billion-dollar club, with Spider-Man Far From Home breaking into 10 figures at the box office. What exactly happened next seems entirely reliant on who is asked. Marvel, it seemed, wanted more creative control over the character and a larger cut of the box office. Sony was perfectly happy with the current agreement, where Disney kept the merchandising rights and 5% of the first run. The 2 companies agreed to disagree, and now Spider-Man is saying goodbye to the MCU. All parties involved have kept a cheerful outlook for the kids. Kevin Feige said, "I'm feeling about Spider-Man gratitude and joy. We got to make 5 films within the MCU with Spider-Man, 2 standalone films and 3 with the Avengers. It was a dream that I never thought would happen. It was never meant to last forever. We knew there was a finite amount of time that we'd be able to do this, and we told the story that we wanted to tell, and I'll always be thankful for that." While Sony Pictures tweeted, "Much of today's news about Spider-Man has mischaracterized recent discussions about Kevin Feige's involvement in the franchise. We are disappointed, but respect Disney's decision not to have him continue as a lead producer on our next live-action Spider-Man film. We hope this might change in the future, but understand that the many new responsibilities that Disney has given him, including all their newly added Marvel properties, do not allow time for him to work on IP that they do not own. Kevin is terrific, and we are grateful for his help and guidance and appreciate the path he has helped put us on, which we will continue." Aw, see, it's nice when they don't fight in front of the kids. One of the contentious points between Marvel and Disney during their brief affair was what exactly was and was not part of the MCU. Spider-Man unequivocally was, but Sony had franchise ambitions of their own that involved Spider-Man's Rogue Gallery, one of the best in comics. High on that priority list of properties was the iconic Spider-Man villain Venom, who got his own standalone movie in 2018 starring Tom Hardy. Even with Peter Parker being absent from the Venom movie, Sony still wanted Venom to be a part of the Spider-Universe, and therefore by extension, the MCU. depending on who you asked and when, Venom existed or didn't exist in a world with Spider-Man. Well, now that Spider-Man is back in the exclusive hands of Sony, that argument can finally be settled. While Spider-Man says goodbye to the Avengers and the MCU, he is now free to say hello to Venom and the other franchise movies Sony had planned, including films based around the Spider-Man Haters Club, the Sinister Six, Silver Sable, and Black Cat. Venom is on his way back to theaters with a second installment set to start filming in late November, with Tom Hardy's Venom prepared to square off against Venom's unruly offspring of sorts, Carnage. In the comics, Venom has been a lethal challenge to the wall crawler. One of the only reasons that Spider-Man has survived his encounters with Venom is the symbiote's complicated feelings about Peter Parker. Having first bonded with the heroically obligated Parker, the symbiote has looked for a way to replicate that sense of purpose, but without the comparative values for things like life to base them on. Carnage, however, does not have that problem. Formed after Venom left a little bit of himself behind in prison, Carnage first bonded with serial killer Cletus Cassidy. Free from any constraints on trying to construct what being a hero might mean to an alien or care for, well, basically anyone, Carnage has been an even more powerful foe for Spider-Man and anyone else who might get in his way. Carnage has been such a big concern that Spider-Man had to enlist help from Venom himself. Now that Spider-Man is solely back in Sony hands, Sony has the opportunity to replicate that, even if a little backwards in their upcoming Venom movie. Tom Holland has stated his commitment to continuing on with the role he so clearly loves playing, saying at this year's D23, "All I know is that I'm going to continue playing Spider-Man and having the time of my life. It's going to be so fun, however we choose to do it. The future for Spider-Man will be different, but it will be equally as awesome and amazing, and we'll find new ways to make it even cooler." Now, there's already an in-universe mechanism for this to happen, and it's one that was introduced to audiences last year in the Oscar-winning animated film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. This gives Sony an out in regards to the tricky situation of Tony Stark. Presumably, Marvel had painted Sony into a corner by making their Spider-Man stories so intertwined with the MCU. Both Spider-Man movies have dealt heavily with Tony Stark's mentorship of the young hero and the fallout from Stark's death. This has included making two iconic Spider-Man villains, the Vulture and Mysterio. Both have their beefs primarily with Tony Stark, but the multiverse, introduced in the MCU by the Avengers' time-tripping shenanigans, creates just the window that Sony needs to slide Peter into their own Spider-Verse. This would mean that an unsuspecting Venom reality would suddenly get a Spider-Man from Earth 19999, otherwise known as the MCU. Things like Edith and Happy Hogan with his flying spider suit creating machine would no longer be at his disposal, which could mean that Spider-Man could get a new look. Maybe even the iconic black suit, that led to Venom in the first place? Perhaps in the collision that lands Peter in the Venomverse temporarily splits Eddie Brock and the symbiote, who takes a ride on the superpowered Peter Parker. Peter, accustomed now to a suit that talks back, tries to tame the symbiote. While younger, Peter has a stronger sense of purpose, but Venom's more aggressive tendencies eventually turn Peter off of the symbiote. In that struggle for control, as Venom returns to Eddie Brock, perhaps even angry at being rejected, and part of him lands with Cletus Cassidy. This would be a bit of a departure from what they appear to be planning, however, with the cinematic Venom story revolving around a nefarious tech company experimenting with the alien symbiotes. So maybe Carnage is created in an attempt to get the Venom symbiote back, and the relationship between Venom and Carnage is removed. Either way, the end result would be a Carnage on the loose, and Spider-Man and Venom having to form an uneasy alliance to stop him. While much of the story would be unique, given how much the stories of both Spider-Man and Venom have departed from what led up to Maximum Carnage, not to mention the absence of other allies like Reed Richards, it would be awesome if the final showdown takes place at a heavy metal concert, where Carnage's downfall is Peter Parker cracking the volume up to 11. Regardless of how Carnage is defeated, the Venom movies have already established their own reasons why Carnage might be too much for Venom to deal with on his own. In the comics, one of the things that makes Venom unique, even among Clintarians, is his origin. Briefly, he was separated from the hive of symbiotes and experimented on by the Kree, who wanted some of that sweet shape-shifting that the Skrull have. In the Venom movie, the Venom symbiote forms an attachment to Eddie Brock because of a kinship he feels. Rather bluntly, Venom considers himself a loser in the symbiote society and sees that in Eddie as well. Not exactly relationship goals, but no one ever said the relationship between Eddie Brock and the symbiote was a healthy one. Eddie's time with Venom has also convinced Venom to stop his fellow symbiotes from taking over the Earth as planned, which means facing down Riot, who Venom points out is stronger and more powerful than he is. In fact, when Eddie asks the Venom symbiote what his chances are, he says basically zero. Venom ultimately doesn't even defeat Riot. After Brock's ex-fiancée uses audio feedback to separate the two symbiotes, Riot is able to reform and runs Eddie through with a Necro Sword. It's only when Venom returns and sabotages the shuttle Riot is on that Riot is killed. So it stands to reason that Venom would need some superpowered super help when dealing with Carnage. Riot was bonded with industrialist Drake, who had his own motives that were misguided, but Cassidy's are just killing for killing's sake. Either way, Sony's grasp on Spider-Man is contingent on a use it or lose it principle, so we're bound to see Spider-Man sooner rather than later.
There's a Venn diagram between love, hate, and obsession for Peter Parker, the spectacular Spider-Man. Where all those circles meet lies the sometimes villain, sometimes anti-hero Venom. Ever since the symbiote glossed up the classic Spider-Man look all the way back in Secret Wars, there has been a special bond between Parker and the alien symbiote who'd become Venom. Over the years, the symbiote had gotten around, but his number one has always been our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Let's take a look at Spider-Man and Venom's special relationship. Villains have always been obsessed with the heroes they menace. Dr. Doom and Reed Richards will always share a special hate to their graves. Xavier and Magneto have their on-again, off-again case of close friends and bitter rivals. The most common element in all of this is that there's a special connection between the two. Often they start as close friends, or at least friendly rivals, and their conflict is born of a bitter sadness at the irreparable rift that forms between them. It's what makes a villain in a hero story bittersweet and compelling. Spider-Man is no stranger to that kind of relationship. His rogues gallery is filled with former mentors and, in one case, the father of his best friend. While Spider-Man is plagued with regret over the people he couldn't save, he's also plagued less metaphorically over the people he couldn't save, who then went on to become villains. But Venom takes one more layer away by not having bonded with Parker metaphorically, but actually literally bonding with him. This has created a very personal connection between protagonist and antagonist that even characters like Dr. Kirk Connors, science mentor turned villain the Lizard, or Norman Osborn, the industrialist alter ego of the Green Goblin, don't have. While these rivals know Peter and that familiarity has bred a degree of contempt, they don't actually want to be Peter. This is a unique dynamic. While Venom, like most villains, tries to kill Spider-Man, for him it's more of an emotionally confused reaction. Innocently enough, it all started with an attempt to clear up one of those nagging inconsistencies that rise up in comic books now and then. Like how a pair of glasses and combing his hair back disguises Clark Kent. For Spider-Man, it's how iconic costumes keep getting torn up during fights. But then it'd be fine the next time he went out. Instead of having the artist draw it up covered with patches, they came up with a different solution. Or that is, a fan named Randy Schueller did. No one can say that Marvel doesn't listen to its fans, huh? Schueller had suggested a new costume that was made of unstable molecules could be given to Parker by Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, that it would enhance his abilities. This is similar to what eventually happens to Spider-Man as he entered the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When Parker is found by the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist Tony Stark, he's wearing a sweatsuit with a pair of goggles that make his new sense more manageable. The black and white design was borrowed from concept art for a new Spider-Woman costume. From those humble beginnings was born one of the most iconic and lethal Spider-Man villains ever. Venom is ranked 22 in IGN's list of top 100 villains of all time. The only Spider-Man villains who outranked him were Norman Osborn and the Kingpin. Of course, it all started in the page of the comic books. During the crossover event Secret Wars, heroes and villains from Earth were brought to the battle world to engage in a battle royale for the amusement of an all-powerful being from the 80s fashion dimension, the Beyonder. We don't care what dimension you're from, the wet perm look is an odd choice. He looks like a jacked Michael Landon raided the costume department over at Miami Vice. Anyways, Spider-Man's costume became threadbare. So Thor and the Hulk, who were no strangers to wardrobe malfunctions themselves, led Parker to a room with a device that presumably read his mind and make whatever he wanted. What he wanted was a cool new black and white suit that generated a seemingly endless supply of webbing. What he got instead was something that wanted to be besties for life. To truly understand the special relationship between Peter Parker and the symbiote that become one half of Venom, we have to look at where the symbiotes come from and what makes this one so odd. Like most of the cosmic Marvel universe, the symbiote's history goes way, way back. Back even before the Celestials. Fans of the MCU were introduced to the Celestials when Peter Quill's dad Ego, the Living Planet, arrived. Ego isn't a Celestial in the comics, but he's also not the most truthful guy in the MCU, so who knows what's true. The Celestials are some of the oldest beings in the Marvel Universe, who set about experimenting with a young universe. This didn't sit well with the creator of the symbiotes, a being named Null. He was so upset about their efforts that he beheaded one of the Celestials. Fans of the MCU's Guardians of the Galaxy might know that severed head as Nowhere. Before Nowhere became Marvel's hive of scum and villainy, it was a forge that Null used to create the symbiotes. With an army of symbiotes, Null did what any powerful being with an army of life-absorbing creatures would. He went to conquering. That's until the symbiotes took a form of a dragon and tried to invade medieval Earth and encountered one Thor, the god of thunder, who was having none of it. Thor knocked the symbiotes so hard that they separated from Null. With their newfound autonomy, they went to the planet Clintar, where they imprisoned the conquering Null and set about trying to find noble beings to bond with. You know, like how you want to eat healthy, but burritos and ice cream just taste so much better? Well, the symbiotes found that messed up people were much more of a rush, adopting a life of absorbing people and feeding off their adrenaline and high emotions until they were all used up. Captain Marvel introduced the Marvel Cinematic Universe to Marvel Comics' long-standing war between alien jerks the Kree and the Skrulls. In the comics, the Kree wanted in on that sweet shape-shifting ability that the Skrulls have, and they decided to do that with a captured symbiote that they modified so the Kree would remain in control. While the plan didn't work out in the end for the Kree, the symbiote was returned to the others. This orphan symbiote decided that it wanted to live in harmony with its host, something the more parasitic symbiotes thought was completely nuts. That's how the symbiote that would become Venom ended up trapped on the battle world. Usually, the exiled alien who becomes the bad guy is Rogue, because they're just too destructive. But Venom is exiled because he cares too much about his host. It's this level of caring, though, that makes his bond with Spider-Man that much closer and that much more disturbing. The symbiote's memory had been wiped after the incident with the Kree, so Venom had no identity to bond with, not even the symbiote collective. That is, until one Peter Parker needed a costume change in Secret Wars. The symbiote could have bonded with anybody. Just about the entire roster of the Marvel Universe was on hand for the amusement of the Beyonder, but bonding with Peter was the emotional junkie's motherlode. Peter had just the right combination of guilt, anger, and adrenaline to give the orphan symbiote all the energy and drive he needed. For a while at least, the symbiote had returned to the post-Null, pre-parasite existence of the Clintarian symbiotes. Unfortunately for both the symbiote and Peter Parker, the parasitic aspects of being a symbiote were still going to be a thing. While Peter thought he just had a cool new suit, it turned out it was like a superhero Ambien, and would take over his body and go superheroing while Peter slept. As it brought out more and more of his aggressive tendencies and tried to take over, Peter Parker had to finally get rid of the symbiote, go back to the tried and true red and blue, and just accept life of fixing his costumes. Not that the symbiote went willingly. Taking advantage of the symbiote's sensitivity to sound, Peter had to tear it off in a bell tower, a scene replicated in the third Sam Raimi Spider-Man film. As we all know, that's when he bonded with another person who had a beef with Spider-Man, this time a reporter named Eddie Brock, whose career was ruined when he identified the wrong man as Sin Eater. MCU completists would recognize Sin Eater as the main antagonist in the final season of Netflix's Jessica Jones. What happens when someone rejected by Peter Parker meets someone who feels wronged by Spider-Man? You get an antagonist who's completely obsessed with Spider-Man in a completely unique and unhealthy way. Since the Venom symbiote has an initial bond with Peter Parker, Venom doesn't set off Peter's spider sense, which is one of the main reasons why Spider-Man is able to fight the way he does. It's also emblematic of the relationship between Venom and Spider-Man. While the Venom symbiote may have brought out the dark side of Peter Parker also brought out the softer side of Venom. Aside from killing Peter Parker, Venom tries to live up to the noble nature of his former host. The problem is, Venom has no idea how any of that works. Venom has a particular soft spot for the homeless, and a particular mean streak when it comes to anyone who looks to exploit or harm the homeless. This would normally move one into the hero column, but Venom doesn't understand the complexities of human morality. Try to explain to a symbiote alien creature from a race of beings who live off the adrenaline of their hosts until they die that they can't just bite the head off an unscrupulous real estate developer. On top of his rather all-or-nothing approach to confronting people he feels do wrong, he's far more of a wrecking ball than a scalpel. This means that the people Venom's trying to defend can end up dying in the process. While the symbiote is still able to think of himself as the lethal defender, these losses deeply affect Brock. Guilt over those they weren't able to save might sound familiar. That's because it's one of the main driving forces why Peter Parker put on the spider suit in the first place. The symbiote has played the field a bit since his introduction. After Eddie was able to break free of Venom, he bonded with a few others in the comics. Another Spider-Man villain, Mac Gargan, otherwise known as the Scorpion, spent some time with the symbiote, and even Peter Parker's old high school bully turned friend, Flash Thompson, used the symbiote to become Agent Venom. He's had some rough times with some of his hosts, including with Lee Price, who'd emotionally abuse and manipulate the symbiote by using his own memories of his life. Having been on the receiving end of being used by a host, Venom returned to Eddie Brock while they both tried and reconcile their shared demons. Venom has lost the memories of his various hosts in exchange for remembering his first host all the way back when he was a part of the Kree experiment. And of course, Peter Parker. This has only made the Spider-Man-Venom relationship even weirder. That's because the relationship between Eddie and Venom has gotten stranger. Venom is trying to be a hero, but has to construct a moral compass from scratch, and Eddie's trying to come to terms with how he feels about Venom, even going so far as to call Venom love. It's a crazy, crazy world. As Spider-Man starts to take center stage in the MCU, there's been a lot of talk and speculation on how exactly Venom will enter the fold. There are already lots of Venom stories in the wider universe. Of course, Nowhere, the floating head of the Celestial that Null killed, has featured prominently in Guardians of the Galaxy. Also included in the first Guardians movie are the Exelon monks. The Exelon were another set of parasites that Null created to feed off the souls of their hosts, who eventually took over a group of Kree, making them the Nameless. Even Hela got in on the action, wielding something that resembled all black the Necro Sword, the original symbiote. Sony and Marvel haven't seemed to be able to agree on whether or not the Tom Hardy Venom is part of the MCU Spider-Man story or not, but given the character's popularity, it seems like it's only a matter of time before he's introduced. With so much of the Venom story already in place in the MCU, we might get a more in-depth take on it. Either way, it's easy to see how the Venom and Spider-Man relationship is pretty unique, even for a character who has a very personal rogues gallery. There's a little bit of the special relationship between Venom and Spider-Man. What's your favorite thing about the Venom-Spider-Man rivalry? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, why not subscribe to CVR and hit that notification bell to form a symbiotic relationship between your inbox and the latest videos. Thanks for watching.